And speaking of Democrats spending, the economy is a top issue for midterm voters, and the White House is already lowering expectations for the July jobs report due out later today.
We're in the transition to a stable and steady growth. And during that transition, what you'll see is instead of that record high breaking job numbers that we've been seeing every month, we're expecting to be closer to 150,000 jobs per month.
Dr. Kevin Roberts is president of the Heritage Foundation and joins me now. Dr. Roberts, good morning. Great to see you. So the Biden administration has touted strong jobs growth as a highlight of the economy. So if this number comes in around 250,000, which I believe is what is expected, what would that say about the economy?
Well, you know, in the mind of the press secretary or the president, it means that somehow that's good news. But once again, this administration continues to talk about these numbers like they're theory or they're in the abstract, when, Carly, as you and I and your audience know well, Americans are affected by this. Individual American households sitting around their dinner table know when that job report comes in and it's fewer jobs available for Americans, that's affecting American families. Therefore, if the press secretary is saying this is what the near and medium term looks like, the American economy is in terrible shape. Unfortunately, while I understand the political consequences of that for the president, we ought to lament that, because as Americans, we really want everyone to flourish. That job report is an indicator that America is really not flourishing.
Yeah, well, also big news overnight. Arizona Senator Sinema has signaled her support for the Inflation Reduction Act. But there's a group of 230 economists. They sent a letter to lawmakers say that the Inflation Reduction Act would do quite the opposite, saying the bill would create immediate inflationary pressure by boosting demand, while the supply side tax hikes would constrain supply by discouraging investment, draining private sector of much needed resources. So if this bill passes, what happens to the economy?
Well, only in Washington, Carly, could you take something that would be so devastating to the economy, as those economists point out, and call it the Inflation Reduction Act. It would do the exact opposite. So to the heart of your question, once again, looking at this through the lens of the average American, I would call the forgotten American for this administration, it's going to have devastating consequences. The direct taxation, the indirect taxation, the burden of those costs has to be borne by someone, and it's going to be on the backs of average Americans. Senator Sinema, Senator Manchin, President Biden are all trying to be cute at best with their rhetoric, at worst, and in reality, they're being really disingenuous. Ultimately, what this boils down to is increased taxation on Americans, increased inflation, which means that we are changing our behavior and how we consume. This is a terrible, terrible piece of legislation that will have tremendous political consequences. But before those political consequences, Carly, we're going to continue to feel more economic pain.
Yeah, well, you mentioned taxes. So Joe Manchin and President Biden say that this would only raise taxes on corporations, but the Joint Committee on Taxation says this bill would actually raise taxes on people making even less than $200,000 a year. How would that happen?
Well, it happens because of the mechanics of the bill. We'll, in the interest of time, won't get into the mechanics, but just from a common sense point of view, looking at the analysts or the analysis of our economists at the Heritage Foundation, the mechanics of the taxation system would mean that downstream from some of these carried interest loopholes, some of the taxation on venture capital work means that Americans earning less than $200,000 a year are going to see an increased tax burden. Also keep in mind that as part of this package, we're giving $80 billion to the Internal Revenue Service. I'm sure Americans last night over dinner were saying, how can we fix America? Let's add 87,000 IRS agents. That tells you everything you need to know about this bill.
Yeah, that's right. And families making up to $300,000 a year also getting a $7,500 tax credit to buy electric vehicles. So I'm sure people struggling to pay for food and gas are really going to be jazzed about that one. Dr. Roberts, thank you so much for joining us and explaining this bill. It looks like it's going to pass. We'll have to wait and see on that.